In the end, there's a very, very old philosophical principle at stake here. And that is that the truth is the truth is the truth, however many lies are told, however many people tell the lies, and however important the people who tell the lies conceive themselves to be. And the truth is, and we now know this is the truth, that global warming isn't a problem. And let me now turn the tables on you a bit and ask you a question. And it'll be very revealing by how you answer it. I'm going to ask you a straightforward scientific question about the global warming issue. Now, as you know, the theory is that down comes the sunlight in through the atmosphere, it comes through in the short wave, so it pierces straight through the atmosphere, hits the ground, is displaced to the long wave where it can interact with greenhouse gases, gets stuck on the way out, and so it can't get out again, and so the planet, atmosphere, and then the oceans warm up. That's the theory. Right. So, supposing the oceans and the land do warm up by, let us say, 1 degree Celsius, will the amount of outgoing radiation from the Earth's surface, escaping all the way out through the atmosphere into space, go up with warming of the surface, stay the same if the surface warms, or go down if the surface warms?
Down.
And why do you say that?
Because I thought it was the answer you wanted.
That is indeed very revealing about you and how congenial you are as a host.
I think the obvious answer would be up.
The obvious answer would be up, and of course you're quite right. And therefore, as the planet warms, there is an increase in the amount of outgoing radiation from the Earth's surface, which we can measure. And why is this point so absolutely crucial? It is because of this. The whole debate on any of these big policy questions, in the end, always boils down just to one single, simple question. And you have to, first of all, as a policy analyst, as I used to do this sort of stuff for Margaret Thatcher, you have to think, what is the right question to ask? And I would submit to you that the right question to ask is, for a given proportionate increase in the atmospheric concentration of carbon dioxide, which is cast by the bedwetters as the villain of the piece, how much warming will we get globally? How much warming for a given increase in CO2 concentration? That's the only question that matters. If it's a big amount of warming, if it is, shall we say, 3¼ degrees Celsius for a doubling of CO2 concentration, as the UN's climate panel thinks it is, then maybe we have a problem, though it certainly won't be as big a problem as they're trying to pretend it is. But here's the point. Suppose it isn't as big an effect as that. Suppose, for instance, it's only ½ degree Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2 concentration. We're not going to manage to double CO2 concentration until somewhere in the middle of the 22nd century. So we're talking of maybe, if the low climate sensitivity theory is right, the low effect of CO2 theory is right, we're looking at ½ degree Celsius of man-made global warming over a period of 150 years. Now, this is hardly something that's worth worrying about whatsoever. A little bit warmer weather would actually be good for the planet, good for the creatures that live on it, and as evidence of that, perhaps 1% of the world's creatures live in the Arctic and the Antarctic, and perhaps 90% live in the tropics. Why? Because warmer is better for life than colder anyway. So a little bit of warming isn't going to do anyone any harm on any view. So why then did I do the experiment with your head to illustrate the point that once there is a warming of a body like the Earth, it will of course radiate more of that extra heat back out into space? Why is that important? It's important for this reason. The entire case, and I mean the entire case of the bedwetters, the entire case for alarm, the entire case for assuming that you're going to get this 3¼ degrees Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2 over the next 150 years, the entire case is based just on one false assumption. That false assumption, which is built in to all the computer models on which the case entirely rests, that assumption is that as the world warms in response to the extra CO2 or for any other reason, then less outgoing radiation will escape into space. Now, this is contrary to reason, it's contrary to elementary physics, but that is what the computer programs that run these models are told to assume. See, the computer models can't tell us the answer to our question about what is the effect of CO2 on temperature, how much warming will we get. They are told that information at the outset. So they're programmed to know the answer, and actually it's the wrong answer, to the question we're trying to ask them. So they are valueless for this purpose. But they are useful in that that demonstrates very clearly what the official view is. The official view is extra warming of the planet at the surface, less outgoing radiation escapes into space. This is balmy. Now, what actually happens...
Okay.
And I'll just come on to this because it finishes the main scientific point I want to make here. Then what happens is we put a satellite up called the Earth Radiation Budget Experiment Satellite. This went up around 20 years ago now. And it simply has a cavitometer pointing at the Earth and measuring how much radiation is coming off the Earth's surface. Now, in fact, it measures radiation coming off from a particular altitude above the Earth called the characteristic emission level. For technical reasons, that's where the radiation appears to be emanating from. But the point is that a detailed study just published by Professor Richard Lindzen, who is the Alfred P. Sloan Professor of Meteorology and Atmospheric Sciences in the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. This is the guy who knows more about the atmosphere than anyone else in the world. He's been studying it for 40 years. He has done a paper where he has simply correlated the changes in surface temperature with changes in the outgoing long-wave radiation, or outgoing radiation of all kinds, in fact. And what he's found is that as the Earth warms, more radiation gets out into space, exactly as you said when you eventually answered the question in a way which you thought was correct rather than congenial. So, and this is quite right. So what we now know is that more radiation gets out to space as it warms. And if the radiation gets out to space, what is it not doing? It's not staying down here causing global warming. It's really as simple as this. And what Dick Lindzen and his postgraduate research colleague Young-Sang Choi have done is they've analysed in detail, year by year, for about 15 years, the change in temperature for that year and the change in outgoing radiation for that year, and they've plotted it on what's called a scatter plot, one for each year. Then they've taken the trend of that, and it shows very clearly that there's 6 times as much radiation escaping into space as a result of any given warming down here than the UN's models predict. 6 times as much as they predict. And that means that the effect of CO2 or any greenhouse gas on temperature is, get this, 1/6 of the UN's central estimate. The central estimate, remember, is 3¼ degrees Celsius for a doubling of CO2. The directly measured result is that it's actually only 1/6 of that, which gives you around 0.5, 0.6 Celsius for a doubling of CO2. And that, in any rational world, will be the end of the scare to go along with this. And you don't need very many bad pennies to turn the apple cart sour, if that isn't too many mixing of metaphors. And so what is happening is you've got, as best I can make it out, perhaps 24 genuinely bad scientists who are knowingly distorting data. It wouldn't be fair to them to name them because they can't answer back as Al Gore can. But there's clear evidence and compelling evidence, which I give in my slideshows and presentations on this, of deliberate tampering with the data. For instance, to exaggerate the extent to which the world has warmed in the last 100 years. To abolish the medieval warm period when the overwhelming results in the literature show that it was real, warmer and global, warmer than the present and global. So for all these dishonesties that are going on, there are people profiting by these dishonesties, and people who are now abjectly terrified because Professor Lindzen's paper has come out. It confirms a string of results all the way from the oceans, which have failed to warm in the last 60 years, even though 80 or 90% of the warming caused by anthropogenic increases in greenhouse gas must end up in the oceans, and it's not happening. You've got to the clouds, which are, the more clouds you get, the more the sunlight gets reflected straight back into space. That causes a cooling, whereas the UN imagines it will cause warming. And in the tropical upper air, about 6 miles up, where the models are all told to expect that there will be warming at 3 times the surface rate, that isn't happening either. Each of these different results, from the oceans via the clouds to the upper troposphere, and then, of course, out to the Irby satellite in space, all give you climate sensitivities of around 0.5 Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2. In other words, we now know from all these different observations, which all agree with one another, though they're being done by separate scientists, by separate methods, we now know that climate sensitivity is low, the debate is over, and in a direction which most of the people watching this programme would probably not have expected.